Hey there, survivors. Thank you for taking the time to listen to this story. If you haven't subscribed yet, go ahead and hit that button. It helps me keep these stories coming. Also, write a comment sharing your job. I'd love to know more about you. Now get comfortable because this is a story you won't want to miss. I've always believed that helping people in their darkest moments is a calling. It's why I joined the paramedic team in our city. I loved the rush of the siren, the quick decisions, the simple joy of knowing I'd done something good after an intense shift. If you'd asked me a month ago whether I'd ever consider abandoning this path, I would have insisted on staying until the end of my days. But that was before everything changed. I remember the night I received the call that started it all. My partner Willow and I had been sitting in the ambulance bay, sipping warm drinks between emergency calls. It was unusually quiet, and we joked that maybe the city had taken a collective nap. Of course, that's the sort of statement that tempts fate. Sure enough, our radio crackled to life, and a dispatcher's urgent voice came through. "All available units, please respond to the intersection of Pine and 8th. Reports of an individual in need of immediate medical assistance." We grabbed our gear and headed out. The drive took barely 3 minutes. The moment we pulled up, a wave of unease settled in the pit of my stomach. The streetlights along Pine were flickering. There was a chill in the air, and I couldn't see the usual late-night traffic or pedestrians. It was eerily still. Willow opened her door first, scanning the area for whoever needed help. Eventually, we spotted a lone figure lying on the sidewalk. We both rushed over. The individual was face down, limbs splayed awkwardly. My first impulse was that he might have slipped or suffered some sort of seizure. I knelt, calling out that I was a paramedic, as Willow stepped around to the other side to check his airway. We both reached for a pulse. His wrist felt cold. My next step was to roll him onto his back, bracing his neck just in case of a spinal injury. As soon as I did, I felt a twist of horror. His skin seemed off, like the color had been drained, but the worst part was his eyes. They were wide open, staring blankly. My training took over. I positioned him flat, told Willow we should start emergency resuscitation, and reached for my bag. Willow checked his respiration. No sign of breathing. She said, "I can't feel a heartbeat." The street was still empty, and the flickering light made everything seem more sinister than it should have been. We worked for minutes, chest compressions, rescue breaths, until out of nowhere, he let out a sudden, gasping breath. Relief poured through me for a second, but then I realized something wasn't right. His hands shot up and gripped Willow's arms, nails biting through her uniform sleeves. She screamed in shock and pain. He locked eyes with her, but there was no recognition or awareness in his gaze, just a strange, desperate intensity. I pried his fingers off her the best I could. He tried to lunge forward. It took all my strength to keep him on the ground, and I shouted for Willow to call for backup. She backed away, trembling, fumbling for the radio. In the chaos, I remember how calm the city around us seemed. There was no traffic, no curious onlookers, just the loud hum of my heartbeat echoing in my ears. Finally, Willow managed to call for help, giving the address and saying we had a combative patient. Then, something I never expected happened. The patient's breathing stopped again, as quickly as it had begun. He went limp, eyes open, hands falling to the pavement. I froze, trying to figure out if he was still with us. I felt for a pulse. Nothing. Absolutely nothing. I glanced up, and Willow met my gaze. We were both confused, frightened. In all our experience, we had never seen a situation like this. Sirens approached, and another ambulance arrived, along with a patrol car. We quickly explained that we found him without a pulse, started life support measures. Then he attacked. The paramedics who arrived second seemed wary but stepped in to help. Even the officers looked taken aback when they checked the man's condition and found him truly gone. It should have ended there with a call to the coroner. But little did any of us know this was just the beginning. The man's body was placed into the second ambulance for transfer. Willow and I had to file an incident report about what happened. We told the officers we suspected a severe neurological condition. maybe a rare infection or a sudden, unpredictable seizure leading to the attack. The officers exchanged uncertain looks, but nobody had a better explanation, so they let us go after taking our statements. It was a long night back at the station. Willow and I couldn't stop replaying the scene in our minds. The next morning, we learned that the hospital had refused to admit the man's body. There was some confusion in the chain of communication, so the second ambulance ended up storing him temporarily at a different facility. That alone was bizarre. It doesn't happen often that a hospital refuses a body. But there was more. A rumor passed among paramedics that the man's condition wasn't normal. People whispered about rechecking vitals and seeing faint movements, even though he had no heartbeat. I tried to laugh it off. Fatigue can make people imagine all sorts of things, right? But as the day wore on, Willow's arms began to show bruises in the shape of handprints. She complained of a tingling sensation. We told ourselves she might just be rattled from the attack. Yet, there was a persistent tension in the air, as though we were waiting for an explanation that never came. That evening, the city was battered by a strange rumor. Multiple calls reporting people stumbling into roads or collapsing on sidewalks, only to get up again and behave erratically. Our dispatch system was overwhelmed with urgent messages. Willow and I hopped in our ambulance, hearts pounding, and headed into the chaos. When we pulled up to the next call, the scene was unsettlingly familiar. Another individual, pale and cold to the touch, lay on the ground. Neighbors crowded around, fear and confusion spreading across their faces. We approached, quickly assessing the person. Same scenario, no pulse, no breathing. We attempted resuscitation, and soon the body jerked, eyes snapping open. This time, we were prepared to jump back before a hand could grab us. The figure sat up, vacant eyes scanning the crowd, then started lunging forward without coordination, as though driven by a single primal urge. Panic spread through the onlookers. Some fled while others screamed for help. Willow and I tried to keep everyone back, and we shouted for the officers who had just arrived to contain the scene. The figure was unsteady on its feet, but it was surprisingly strong, pushing past anyone who tried to intervene. Eventually, with the help of the officers, we managed to restrain the individual. They still showed no heartbeat. I remember one officer, sweat on his brow, staring at the paramedic monitor. He whispered, "This can't be right. There's no pulse, but it's moving." Authorities decided to transport the restrained person to the hospital. Willow and I backed away, hearts thudding in our chests. In all my years of medical experience, I never thought I'd witness someone so cold, so lifeless, suddenly stand up and move like that. It defied all logic. We stayed on the scene a while longer to provide basic first aid for anyone who'd been knocked down. More patrol cars arrived, and a hush fell over the crowd when we saw an unmarked vehicle pull up, a sure sign that higher authorities were getting involved. Men in suits and protective gear emerged, talking quietly among themselves. One approached us, flashed an official badge, the kind you don't argue with, and asked for a thorough account of what we'd seen. I recounted the facts as best I could, omitting nothing. The official nodded grimly and warned us, "Speak of this with caution. We're still assessing the threat." Then they left, ushering the restrained figure into their vehicle. I tried to find out which hospital they were taking them to, but the official wouldn't say. That night, rumors swelled. Emergency calls spiked. People reported similar occurrences all over the city. It felt like we were sitting on a ticking clock, waiting for an official statement. Yet none arrived. I checked the local news on my phone repeatedly, but there were only vague notices telling people to stay calm and remain indoors if possible. By the time the sun rose, it felt like days had passed. Willow and I were running on fumes when we arrived at the station to find most of our colleagues in full panic mode. The rumors had become more than that. They were now reported events. Multiple paramedics had encountered individuals who exhibited the same baffling symptoms. No pulse, no standard vital signs, yet physically active and dangerously aggressive. Someone said the word infected. Another said contagious. But the official stance was still unclear. While we were catching our breath, a supervisor called us into a small meeting room. They explained that, as of that morning, the city was declaring a local emergency. We were told that some form of unknown infection was spreading, but the details were sparse. The supervisor insisted we follow new safety protocols, additional protective equipment, and strict guidelines for who we'd treat and how we'd handle them. My mind churned with confusion and dread. We had just enough time to change into heavier protective suits before being assigned to another high-priority call. When Willow and I reached the scene, it looked like something out of a nightmare. A group of people huddled behind vehicles calling out for help. At least 2 individuals were staggering around, showing that same lifeless expression. One was missing a shoe, moving in a slow shuffle, reaching out blindly. We approached carefully, instructing bystanders to keep a safe distance. As I drew closer, I recognized that one of the staggering figures had the same grayish skin tone I had seen before. His gaze was vacant, and he only seemed to react if someone got too close, like a reflex, reaching for them. A brave neighbor had tried to knock him down to prevent him from hurting anyone, but it made no difference. The individual just kept moving. Willow and I were about to radio for more support when we noticed the second figure begin to move faster. She lunged at a bystander, who screamed. Willow sprinted over to help, trying to pull the bystander away. I joined in, urging them to run. In the process, I got a closer look at the figure's face. Lips drew back, eyes unblinking, an unwavering focus on the nearest living person. Yet I never saw a wound or any other typical sign of serious illness. It was as though they were empty shells, driven by an incomprehensible impulse. Finally, officers arrived to help contain the situation. We called for backup ambulances, but they were tied up across the city with similar incidents. The sense of isolation was crushing. We quickly realized that standard protocols, like trying to talk someone down or physically restrain them, were almost useless here. One officer shouted at us to get back as more official-looking vehicles pulled up. He said, "The situation's getting out of hand. We have orders to quarantine the area." The word quarantine sent a cold shiver through me. They began cordoning off the entire neighborhood, ushering residents into their homes, blocking roads, and shouting instructions through loudspeakers. Willow and I found ourselves in the middle of it, uncertain if we could leave. Our ambulance was parked on the street with equipment inside. Eventually, an official in heavy protective gear approached us, scanning our badges. He directed us to a makeshift command post in a nearby parking garage. Inside the command post, I saw a variety of medical staff, local authorities, and a few people in unmarked suits. A higher-level response team, presumably. They were gathered around a table covered in city maps. The tension was thick. One official was describing a pattern of spread. Certain areas reported these walking patients more frequently, and those areas were rapidly growing. Another official was discussing a possible cause, though no one seemed certain. Some suspected a viral agent. Others guessed it was an unprecedented neurological disorder. Willow and I were given a chance to speak. We shared our experience from the very first patient we encountered on Pine Street, and how it now seemed like he was patient 0, or close to it. The officials exchanged glances, scribbling notes. One of them, tall and serious, told us, "We need to find him. We need to determine what happened to his remains. That may be our best shot at developing a solution." That was the moment it clicked for me. The man's body had never been properly admitted to the main hospital. It was stowed somewhere else due to confusion. "We can help you track him down," I offered, uneasy but determined. Willow nodded in agreement, though I saw the tremor in her hands. The official studied us, then said, "Time is running short. The infection is spreading faster than we can contain it. If you can find any clue about how this started, you'll be saving countless lives." We left the command post with an address. The rumor was that the second ambulance, which had originally taken patient Zero's body, ended up rerouting to an overflow medical center on the other side of town. We had to get there. But the city was rapidly unraveling. People were panicking, barricading themselves in their homes, or fleeing in cars loaded with suitcases and blankets. Emergency sirens echoed in every direction, and the faint flicker of lights across the skyline hinted at rolling power disruptions. Willow and I navigated blockades, showing our paramedic credentials at checkpoints. Our ambulance's usual wail now felt like a lonely call in the midst of chaos. The roads that weren't blocked were filled with anxious drivers, but thanks to the red lights and the official pass, we managed to weave through. When we arrived at the Overflow Medical Center, it was eerily deserted. The parking lot was barely lit. The main entrance door was propped open, a single overhead light flickering in the lobby. My chest tightened as I stepped inside. The smell was stale, the temperature chilly. We called out, announcing we were paramedics, but received no answer. Echoes of our footsteps followed us. A few minutes of searching led us to a corridor lined with patient rooms. Most were empty, except for scattered medical supplies and overturned chairs. At last, we found a room that looked like it had been hastily converted into a morgue. Metal tables stood in neat rows, with only a couple of them occupied by covered forms. I approached cautiously, scanning the ID tags. Willow stood by the door, her face pale. No. One of the tags matched the name from the Pine Street call, our patient 0. With trembling hands, I lifted the edge of the covering. The face underneath was unmistakable. He looked exactly as he had the night we found him, pale, eyes half open, features frozen. But now, there was a thick strap over his chest, as though the staff had anticipated sudden movement. My heart pounded. We finally had him, but what good was that if we didn't know what to do next? Did we try to contact the response team again? Did we try to collect samples? Willow took a step forward, saying, "We need help." Her voice echoed. She glanced around, half expecting someone to answer. Silence. Then softly, something rattled in the corner. We swung our flashlights over to see a figure crumpled against the wall, wrapped in a white coat. A doctor, presumably. His eyes fluttered open, and he managed a faint whisper. We rushed over, noticing dark stains on his coat. He was breathing but barely coherent. Willow knelt, checking him for injuries. He mumbled about experiments, about trying to figure out how to stop the condition from spreading, and about how the patient on the metal table had suddenly shown signs of life. The rest of his words were lost in a dazed mumble. Desperate, we asked him for details. He looked at us, fear etched into every line of his face. "It spreads, but not in the way we think," he whispered. "It might be in the air, or maybe in the fluids. I don't know." His voice trailed off, and he lost consciousness again. Willow put a hand against his neck. "He's still alive, but he needs proper care," she said. We turned to the body on the metal table. My eyes locked on the strap around the chest. It was fastened so tightly it pressed into the man's torso. Someone had gone to great lengths to keep him from moving. A heavy sense of dread pooled in my stomach. If this was indeed the first or one of the first infected individuals, then we were in uncharted territory. I was about to speak when the strap jerked. Instantly, Willow and I jumped back. The body moved. The arms strained against the restraint, the eyes snapping wide as though awakened from a deep slumber. I almost dropped my flashlight. The man's mouth opened and closed soundlessly. Despite the total lack of normal vital signs, he was active again. Willow stifled a gasp, her grip tightening on the doctor's shoulder. I forced myself to stay still. The figure on the table twisted, the metal clasp squeaking under pressure. For a moment, I thought it might break free, but the restraint held. The sound of it struggling against the strap filled the silent room. I could only imagine the terror these medical staff must have felt when they realized their patient wasn't as deceased as he appeared. We had to move fast. I grabbed my phone to call the officials from the makeshift command post. Miraculously, a signal was still available, though it crackled with static. After a few tries, I got through. A harried voice answered on the other end, demanding to know our location. I rattled off the address of the overflow center. In the background, I could hear urgent voices, wailing sirens and alarms. The person on the line said they'd dispatch a retrieval team, but we needed to secure the body and our safety until then. The next hour was a blur. Willow and I administered what care we could to the unconscious doctor, who was stable but weak. We also fortified the morgue room door, stacking chairs and tables, fearing that more infected individuals might wander in. All the while, the figure strapped to the table continued to writhe, eyes open, silent except for the occasional rasp in its throat. We tried not to look at it directly for too long. It was too unsettling. At one point, Willow asked in a hushed tone, "How are we supposed to treat something like this?" The question hung in the air, unanswerable. Our training covered countless conditions, but not this. It was not a scenario where the body was biologically gone, yet still moving. My mind strayed to the possibility that it was some extremely rare condition that simulated death. But the sightings around the city told a different story. An outbreak with no clear cause, turning regular people into these husks that roamed and attacked. Eventually, the official retrieval team arrived. Their vehicles rumbled into the parking lot, heavy doors slamming shut. A group of individuals in advanced protective suits entered the building, announcing themselves with clipped commands. We shouted to guide them. Relief washed over me when I saw them. A specialized unit, armed with medical gear and containment tools. They took one look at the figure on the table and immediately set to work securing it in a reinforced container. Cautious, methodical. They also tended to the unconscious doctor, preparing to transport him for further care. One of the lead officials pulled me aside, speaking in a firm but subdued voice. "You and your partner have been close to this situation from the start. We'll need your full cooperation moving forward." The official handed me a sealed folder. Inside you'll find guidelines, contact information and additional instructions. Report anything new you encounter. We need to stay informed. I nodded, though I felt no real comfort. He continued. "We'll do our best to isolate the cause, but the situation in the city is deteriorating rapidly. I suggest you regroup at our command center, or, if you feel unsafe traveling, find a secure location and wait for further instructions." After they left with patient 0, the doctor, Willow and I retreated to our ambulance. We sat in the front seats, fatigued and emotionally drained. Through the windshield, we watched the specialized team's vehicles disappear into the night. All around us, the city looked eerily still. No normal hum of traffic, only the distant echoes of sirens. I opened the sealed folder. The guidelines were straightforward but chilling. Avoid contact with anyone displaying symptoms. Use extreme caution when responding to calls, and notify the command center immediately if encountering new cases. Then came the most unsettling part, a small note reading, "We suspect this may not be limited to our city." That single line turned my blood to ice. Willow closed her eyes, leaning against the headrest. "I can't believe this is happening," she said. "Do you think it's going to spread everywhere?" I had no answer. The tension in the air felt like a countdown. I thought of my home, my family, all the people we knew who had no clue how bad this was getting. We made the call to drive back toward the command center, where we could hopefully be of use. The journey was surreal. We passed through neighborhoods where lights flickered behind drawn curtains. Occasionally we saw flashlights moving in windows. At each checkpoint, the guards seemed more on edge than before, scanning vehicles and refusing entry to anyone without medical or official clearance. At the command center, the mood was even more somber than when we left. Officials rushed from one makeshift workstation to another. The phone lines crackled, displaying dozens of incoming calls. Announcements blared over speakers, directing resources to different hotspots. It was chaos with a thin veneer of order. Willow and I handed the officials the sealed folder. We gave our account of what happened at the overflow center, including the doctor's condition. The lead official nodded, face grim. "Thank you," he said. "We've placed the individual you recovered in a high-security ward, along with other early cases. Our teams are working around the clock to figure out how this infection spread." I asked if they had any new insights or a plan to stop it. The official's silence was answer enough. It felt like everything was moving in slow motion, yet also too fast. More calls came in, and more sightings of these infected individuals. The city was losing ground, block by block. A hush fell across the room when an emergency broadcast played on a large screen in the corner. The local leader announced a curfew, urging everyone to stay indoors and avoid contact with anyone outside their immediate household. Scenes of deserted streets and official vehicles patrolling in the background painted a stark picture. I turned to Willow, exhausted but still driven by a sense of duty. "We need to do something," I murmured. She nodded, though tears welled at the corner of her eyes. "But what can we do? We can't fix them. We can't even slow the spread." I placed a hand on her shoulder, trying to ground us both. "We can still help people," I said. "We keep doing our jobs, helping the uninfected, giving the officials every bit of information we find. That's all we can do right now." So, that's what we did. For several days, we responded to calls, some from frightened residents who barricaded themselves inside apartments, others from medical facilities running low on supplies. Each time, we practiced extreme caution, donned extra protective gear, and prayed we wouldn't come face to face with more infected. But inevitably, we did. Sometimes we managed to prevent tragedy. Other times, we arrived too late. During those days, I couldn't shake the memory of that first call on Pine Street. The man was lying on the sidewalk, pale and seemingly gone. The sudden jolt of life that left me rattled. Now the entire city was wrestling with that horrifying realization, that the line between life and death was blurred by something we still couldn't understand. This is my story, shared in hopes of giving people insight into how it all began, at least from my point of view. There are many gaps I can't fill, many questions I can't answer. The officials are still working around the clock, and rumors suggest that other regions have already begun to report similar cases. This might be more widespread than we feared. All I know is that I picked up the first infected patient, and it changed my life forever. The city I once knew, the job I once loved, it's all different now. Our best hope lies in cooperation, in proper containment measures, and in the hope that someone out there will uncover the cause and develop a solution to reverse this horrifying condition. If you're reading this from a place of safety, count yourself lucky. Follow official guidance, stay indoors if told, and look out for those who need help. Because if there's one thing I've learned through this ordeal, it's that we can't handle it alone. Humanity's only chance is unity, caution, and the perseverance to protect each other, no matter how grim the outlook seems. Even if it feels like we're surrounded by darkness, we have to keep searching for light, because hope might be all that stands between us and the spreading tide of the unknown.